But there's a cruel twist in building a body that can't be broken. What happens when the only thing you want is for it to break? Betrayed by his own blood. Hunted by the empire he had fought for decades. Alone, in a crumbling fortress above the Black Sea, Mithridates finally reached for the one weapon he thought he could always count on. Poison. Swift. Silent. Absolute. But as the bitter liquid slid down his throat, nothing happened. No burning. No fading heartbeat. Just silence. Just breath. And in that breath, he realized the unthinkable. He had made himself too strong to die. This is not a story of heroic battles or noble last stands. This is the story of a man who spent his life preparing for every possible threat, except the one that came from within. A man who tried to escape death, and found himself trapped inside his own survival. To understand the depth of Mithridates' final torment, we need to go back, far back, to where it all began. The kingdom of Pontus, perched on the southern edge of the Black Sea, was no ordinary land. It was a crossroads of empires, Persian ambition to the east, Greek intellect to the west, and it was soaked in betrayal, espionage, and royal blood. This was the world young Mithridates was born into. A world where kings were assassinated with wine goblets and smiles. His father, Mithridates V, was one of them, murdered during a royal banquet. The poison was slow, silent, and untraceable. It killed without warning, without pain. And it came, not from a foreign enemy, but from within his own court. That moment shattered everything. The young prince learned early, in a world ruled by whispers and blades hidden in robes, trust was suicide. But Mithridates didn't just fear poison, he studied it. He obsessed over it. He would turn fear into formula and survival into science. While other kings trained in war, he trained his liver. He disappeared for years, into the mountains, into remote temples, into the silence of ancient texts, collecting knowledge from Greek physicians, Persian alchemists, Scythian shamans. When he returned, he was no longer just a prince. He was a living experiment. Every day he consumed carefully crafted mixtures, herbs, venoms, minerals, crushed gems, designed to kill in large doses but strengthen in small ones. He didn't just survive poison. He invited it into his veins. They called it Mithridatism, building immunity through calculated self-poisoning. It would become his legacy, his legend, and eventually his curse. But this wasn't merely about science. This was power theater. In a world where assassins were everywhere, Mithridates wanted his enemies to know, "You can't touch me." No goblet, no meal, no kiss was a threat. His body had become a fortress. But the thing about fortresses is that when the enemy isn't outside the walls, but inside your own soul, that fortress becomes a cage. Mithridates didn't just build resistance, he built a mythology. Each morning began like a ritual, deeper than prayer, more precise than science. In the hidden chambers of his palace, attended only by his most trusted alchemists and Scythian mystics known as the Agori, the king consumed his deadly breakfast. A tablet no larger than an almond, laced with more than 50 substances. Pontic honey, crushed emeralds, wolfsbane, snake venom, powdered rue, a trace of hemlock, each one deadly on its own. But together, in his proportions, they became his shield. He wasn't just surviving poison, he was teaching his body to eat it. And it worked. The slow conditioning rewired his metabolism. His liver became a chemical furnace. His blood a battlefield. He grew stronger, faster. Some said he glowed with unnatural energy. But this wasn't just a miracle of biology, it was a dark form of statecraft. He tested new compounds on condemned criminals, watching as some screamed, some writhed, some fell silent, to refine his formulas. Their pain became his data. Morality was irrelevant. Survival was the only virtue. Every dose he consumed was a defiance, not just against poison but against Rome, against treachery, against fate. To his people he was more than a king. He was a living god, a man who had outwitted nature itself. To his enemies he was a nightmare, a ruler who could not be assassinated, could not be broken, could not be killed. But every power comes with a price. As the years passed, the poison didn't just shape his body, it shaped his mind. The line between protection and obsession began to blur. He grew more isolated, more paranoid. He trusted no one, not generals, not lovers, not even his children. His court became a place of whispers and watching eyes. And while he projected strength, inside, a question began to fester. If death could not take him, what would? For decades, Mithridates defied Rome, not with brute force but with brilliant chaos. He waged war not just with armies but with assassins, alliances, and fear. He outlasted consuls, crushed legions, and carved a shadow empire stretching from the Aegean to the Caucasus. To the Roman Senate he was a ghost they couldn't catch, a poison they couldn't purge. But time was his real enemy. Because even the strongest poison king grows old. Even the most fortified mind begins to crack. As his campaigns dragged on and his paranoia deepened, the walls around him thickened. He demanded more from his people. More gold, more loyalty, more blood. And when the people began to break, so did his inner circle. The betrayal didn't come from Rome. It came from his son. Pharnaces too, the very heir he had trained to succeed him, saw the writing on the wall. Rome was rising. Pontus was bleeding. His father had become a liability. So Pharnaces did what Mithridates had once done to survive. He betrayed family before family betrayed him. He made a secret pact with the Romans, stirring rebellion from within. And when the moment came, the empire Mithridates had built over decades collapsed almost overnight. Cities turned against him. Allies vanished. His mercenaries fled. He was no longer the untouchable poison god. He was an old man alone, pacing the cold stone floors of a dying citadel in Pantikapaean, present-day Crimea. All that remained were a few loyal guards, and his two youngest daughters. The end was close. He could feel it in every silence, every shadow, every whisper that once carried fear and now carried pity. He knew what would come next. Chains. Shame. Rome. Pompey, the Roman general, wouldn't just kill him. He'd parade him through the streets of Rome, bound and broken, as a prize of conquest. And for a man like Mithridates that was worse than death. So, he turned to the one escape he had always kept hidden. A small compartment in the hilt of his sword. Inside, a deadly poison, untouched, potent, and meant for this exact moment. But what happened next would twist the knife of fate deeper than anyone could imagine. He unsheathed his sword, not to fight but to escape. In the hilt, sealed for years, waited a poison he had saved for one purpose. A clean death. A final, controlled act by a man who had always planned every outcome. He wasn't alone. His daughters, Mithridates and Nyssa, stood by him, silent and unafraid. They knew what Roman captivity would mean: shame, exploitation, forced marriage, or worse. So they made a simple request. Let us go first. And Mithridates, the warlord king, granted them mercy. They drank. And within moments their bodies fell, quiet, still, gone. Then, the king drank. He waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. No numbness. No fading vision. No burning throat. Just a slow, creeping horror. The same body he had forged into a fortress. Now refused to let him leave it. He drank more. Still nothing. His mind spiraled. His heart pounded. Sweat poured from his skin, but death did not come. And then came the realization, slow, cold, irreversible. He had made himself immune, even to death. What followed was not death, but a descent into torment. He began to pace violently, hoping movement would speed the toxin through his veins. When that failed, he ran. Jumped. Screamed. Tried to make his heart race faster. Anything to make the poison work. But his body, so meticulously trained, resisted every attempt. The scene was grotesque. A once great king, sprinting in circles in a darkened room, surrounded by the still, lifeless bodies of his daughters. And he could not join them. He tried the sword next. Raised it, trembling, but his arm lacked the strength. The blade barely pierced the skin. The man who had cheated poison for 30 years. Now couldn't even bleed himself to death. This wasn't a death scene. This was cosmic punishment. A final, bitter joke from the gods he never feared. And for once, the king who planned everything had no plan left. The hours dragged. Mithridates, once feared across continents, now staggered through the remains of his own failure, breath ragged, body poisoned yet defiant, mind unraveling. His daughters lay dead. His empire was gone. And death still hadn't come. When Roman soldiers finally stormed the citadel, they didn't find a proud king prepared to die with honor. They found a broken man, slumped, exhausted, eyes hollow, blade in hand, soaked in sweat and shame. This wasn't the Mithridates they had feared. This was a prisoner of his own survival. But even then he wouldn't let Rome take his final act. He summoned his most loyal bodyguard, a Gallic warrior named Bituitus. He didn't plead. He commanded. Finish it. And Bituitus, moved by loyalty or pity, maybe both, drove his sword into the king's chest. Finally, after everything, Mithridates VI was dead. But not by poison. Not by his own hand. By the mercy of another man, a man whose name history barely remembers. the final humiliation. This was a king who had plotted every step of his life like a chess game against fate. But in the end, fate still won. He died not as a god, not as a warrior, but as a man begging for death he could no longer claim. And yet, the irony didn't end there. When Roman General Pompey received the news, he was both relieved and disappointed. He had dreamed of parading Mithridates in chains through the streets of Rome, a living trophy of Roman dominance. Instead he got a corpse. But even dead, Mithridates sent a message. Pompey, perhaps out of respect, or propaganda, ordered the body buried with honor, in the royal tombs of Sinope. No torture. No desecration. Just silence. Because sometimes a man's failure speaks louder than his triumph. And Mithridates' failure was absolute, but unforgettable. He became more than a man. He became a warning. Death silenced Mithridates. But it didn't bury him. His body was laid to rest. But his name, and his legacy, would echo for centuries. To Rome, he was the last serious challenger from the East, the final ghost of Alexander's shattered empire. With his death, Hellenistic resistance was effectively crushed. The East was no longer wild. It was Rome's. But history has a strange sense of humor. Because the man who spent his life fearing poison became the father of toxicology. His legendary antidote, a complex blend of herbs, venoms, minerals, and honey, became the blueprint for what would be called Mithridatium. Roman doctors tried to recreate it. Medieval physicians swore by it. Even centuries later, Renaissance alchemists hunted the recipe like it was the philosopher's stone. It wasn't just medicine. It was myth. A cure for death. A spell in a jar. And his method, exposing yourself to poison in small doses to build resistance, would live on too. Today we call it immunology. Modern science applies the same principle to vaccines, antivenoms, allergy treatments. Mithridates didn't just survive history. He infected it. But his legacy wasn't just scientific. It was philosophical, even psychological. For generations, thinkers would look at his story and ask, what happens when our greatest protections become our greatest prisons? What do we lose when we try too hard to control the chaos? What's the price of fearing death so much that we build lives we can't escape? To some, Mithridates was a genius, a man ahead of his time. To others, he was a madman, consumed by fear, destroyed by the very system he created. But to everyone who heard his story, one truth rang clear. You can survive everything, and still lose. Long after his bones turned to dust, Mithridates refused to vanish. In the Middle Ages, his name echoed through apothecaries and royal courts. Doctors invoked him. Alchemists worshipped him. Kings feared the poisons he once tamed. In 1673, French playwright Jean Racine turned his tragedy into theater. In 1770, a young Mozart wrote an opera bearing his name. And in secret libraries and war rooms, generals studied him, not for his science but for the psychology behind his downfall. Because Mithridates had become more than a historical figure. He had become a mirror. To every ruler obsessed with security. To every empire desperate to control fate. To every mind afraid of vulnerability. His story asked one haunting question. Can you be too prepared to survive? Modern strategists study him as a cautionary tale. The man who fortified himself so well that he trapped himself inside his own defenses. Psychologists invoke him when speaking about obsessive control, about the fear of letting go. Even in the age of biotech and AI, where we build smarter, stronger, safer systems, his story still whispers. What happens when your safety becomes your prison? Mithridates didn't die by poison. He didn't die by sword. He died by design, his own design. He was undone by the very brilliance that once saved him. And that's what makes his end more terrifying than any battlefield or execution. Because his horror wasn't loud. It was quiet, inevitable, and entirely self-inflicted. He lived to avoid death. And in doing so, created a death no man should ever face. So today, when scientists speak of exposure and resistance, when generals speak of fallback plans and fortresses, when thinkers speak of risk and resilience, somewhere, whether they know it or not, they're speaking about the poison king of Pontus. A man who made himself untouchable. A man who became a myth. And a man who, in trying to escape fate, wrote one of the most tragic, unforgettable fates in all of human history.